on men of color in community colleges, trends, challenges, and opportunities. I'm Frank Harris III, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, and together we co-direct the Minority Male Community College Collaborative at San Diego State University. So today, this is the agenda that will guide our conversation today. We're going to start, we've actually already started introductions and an overview of the webinar. We'll transition into national trends, key issues, and concerns, which these are things that have essentially brought us together today. And then we'll talk about M2C3 and some of the inquiry tools that we've developed in our partnership with community colleges to support and serve men of color. We'll also discuss some salient findings from the Community College Survey of Men, and we'll provide more detailed information about the survey later in the webinar. And we will conclude with implications. And once we are done with the implications, we'll be happy to take any questions that you have at the end. And we are also going to stay on, pardon me. If you have questions or comments throughout the webinar, there are two ways you can get those to us. You can use Twitter, use our Twitter hashtag. It's hashtag M2C3, and our Twitter handles are here as well, at fharris3 and at jlukewood. And you can also email us at the account m2c3@sdsu.edu. And we'll do our best to monitor both the Twitter feed and the email throughout the webinar and respond to questions. But in the event that we aren't able to do that, we'll stay on the webinar until about 30 minutes after it concludes and continue to respond to questions and engage in conversation. And as Andrea mentioned, there will be an audio recording archive of the entire webinar that we will make available on our website. And as some of you are probably aware, recently the White House launched the My Brother's Keeper initiative to create opportunities for boys and men of color in society with a particular focus on education. Now, many of us, and perhaps many of you who are on the webinar, have been engaged in this work before it was popular, but we're glad to see that there is some national momentum to improve outcomes for boys and men of color. And many of the concerns and issues that motivated us to create M2C3 and to do this work are also what informed the My Brother's Keepers initiative, and motivated the White House to actually start to take some action to bring some attention and awareness to some of the issues. We thought we would spend some time discussing national trends and issues, national trends, issues, and concerns with respect to men of color in community colleges in particular. And the data that you see here are from the National Post-Secondary Student Age Study. And these data are from 2012, and they represent the population of men in community college. In particular, this slide focuses on grade point averages, or grade point average distributions for those with GPAs lower than 2.5, between 2.5 and 2.9, 3.0 and 3.4, and 3.5 and above. And as you can see here, Black men, and closely followed by Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander men, have the highest percentage of men with GPAs at the 2.5 or lower range. And also a smaller percentage of Black, Latino, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander men have GPAs in the upper echelon of the scale. Now, we would like to take a moment to point out that the Asian American data that are presented here are not disaggregated, so we know that these numbers will probably look different if we had separate categories for Southeast Asian men, Vietnamese, Hmong, for example. But this is one of the challenges of using national data sets, is that the Asian American and even the Hispanic Latino categories are not adequately disaggregated, in our opinion. The data we have presented here also come from the data presented here come from the Beginning Post-Secondary Students Longitudinal Study, and it depicts transfer outcomes for a cohort of men who enter community college during the 2002-2003 academic year. And presented are the percentage of men in each racial ethnic group who transferred within 6 years, so by 2009. And it's important to note here that the data are for men who, all of these data are for men who indicated an intent to transfer. And as you can see, the rates for Latino and Black men are lower than the 43% rate for all the men in the cohort. And the data presented in this slide are also from the same cohort of students discussed in the previous slide. And these are the percentages of men in each racial ethnic group who earned a certificate, degree, or transferred within 6 years. And what's good about these data is that unlike most federal data sets, a distinction is made between men who attend part-time and those who attend full-time. And this is important because, as we all probably know, the overwhelming majority of men of color in community colleges are enrolled part-time. And in part-time data, and I also want to note here that part-time data are not presented for Asian students in this particular data set because the sample size did not meet the reporting threshold. But there are a couple of things we'd like to point out to you. First is that the part-time rates, which are depicted in the red bars for each group, are not good for any of the groups, but they're especially low for Black and Hispanic men. And second, the most common attendance pattern is a mixture of part-time and full-time enrollment, which are depicted in the green bars for each group. And interestingly, Hispanic men who enroll part-time and full-time actually have better attainment rates than those who only attended full-time. And in looking across the published literature on the experiences and outcomes of men of color in community colleges, some salient themes are evident. For example, men report regularly encountering racial prejudice and stereotypes based on their appearance, so baggy clothes, tattoos, braided hair. And this is evident in the second quote on this slide. Quote, they, staff, look at me like I'm crazy because I've got dreads. They look at me like, what are you doing here on this campus? And I'm like, damn, I paid tuition. Don't be looking at me and always judging me. And men of color in community colleges also report experiencing conflicts related to their masculine identities, notably a reluctance to seek help with personal and academic problems. Another conflict related to gender is the tendency to view college exclusively from the perspective of a breadwinner. And we see an example of this conflict in the quote on the bottom left of the slide. Quote, what kind of man has 2 kids and quits working so he can go and read poetry at some damn college? And finally, we see an apprehension to engage in classroom discussions because of fear of being perceived by faculty as, quote, academically inferior. And both of the quotes on this slide speaks to this issue. And I'll read the second one. Quote, I mean, if the teacher asks me to say something or asks me a question, then I'll answer it. But I'm not going to just raise my hand. I'm not a person like that. I'm not shy or anything. It's just I don't want to embarrass myself. And we share all of these data to provide some important context as to why we began M2C3. And we really began it in large part in response to the need to build capacity within community, to help build capacity within community colleges to serve men of color equitably and responsibly, and the need to generate scholarship and empirically derived insights on men of color in community colleges. Our work is informed by Estella Ben-Simone and her colleagues in the Center for Urban Education, specifically the concepts of equity-mindedness and institutional responsibility, in that we do not prioritize student deficits in accounting for the reasons why men of color do not experience success. Instead, we focus on the roles that institutions and educators play in ensuring success for these students. We also emphasize contextualized problem defining, and that we believe it is critical to examine the problem within the context of an institution and not assume that the reasons why men of color are not successful in one institution will be the same for another. Instead, we think it's necessary to spend some time studying the problem and engaging in inquiry at the institution, which will in turn lead to more informed and and effective solutions. This process is presented in the second set of boxes on this slide that is labeled the inquiry paradigm. And we see ourselves, in our work, situated in the inquiry into the causes box in the middle of the figure. And to facilitate contextualized problem defining and inquiry at community colleges, we've developed two tools. The first tool is the Community College Survey of Men, which is a comprehensive instrument that was developed to assess the needs of men of color in community colleges and measure factors that impact their success. The CCSM is comprised of 32 question blocks with multiple scales and subscales in each block. And it was designed to collect data on issues that impact the educational experiences and success of men of color in community colleges, and was informed by the public literature on community college student success, college men and masculinities, and racial ethnic equity in education. The second tool, the Community College Student Success Inventory, looks at salient practices identified by researchers and subject matter experts as being integral to the success of men of color in community colleges. It is comprised of 6 areas, each of which has a set of indicators of effective educational practice to serve men of color equitably and responsibly. And the 6 areas are financial aid, student support services, teaching and learning, institutional research, minority male initiatives and programs, and early alert systems. And the tool should be used as a starting point to guide attention, discussion, and collective sense-making. You should also note that the CCSSI is available on our website and can be downloaded for use as a hard copy instrument. And the model that's predicted in this slide, the socio-ecological outcomes model, guides all of the work that we do and all of the data that you will see presented in this presentation. Now, we do not have the time to walk through the model in detail, but we would like to direct your attention to the SEO domains that are positioned in the middle of the model. The non-cognitive domain includes psychosocial factors that impact students' identities, self-efficacy, locus of control, intrinsic interests, and the meanings they derive from their experiences. And within this domain is the gender/masculinity construct. And we measure masculinity in 4 ways. 1, competitive ethos, or the extent to which men of color assume that they have to compete with other men in order to be successful. Breadwinner orientation, or the extent to which men of color are pursuing community college education as a way to earn money and not necessarily as a means to educate themselves or to better themselves as individuals. 3, school as a feminine domain, which is the extent to which men of color see school as a space that's designed primarily for the success of women and less so for men. And help seeking, which examines the extent to which men of color are comfortable seeking help for academic challenges, academic, personal, and other challenges that they may experience. The second domain, the academic domain, includes variables that are directly related to students' academic experiences and ultimately shape academic outcomes, such as faculty-student interaction, students' academic engagement, and commitment to a course of study. The environmental domain captures factors situated outside of the campus context that have a direct influence on men of color's engagement and success in community colleges. These factors have a tendency to direct students' time and attention and resources away from their college endeavors. However, some factors in this domain can have a positive effect on student success and actually mediate barriers to their success. And finally, the campus ethos domain accounts for students' connectedness to the campus and the extent to which they have meaningful interpersonal interactions with peers and partake in student activities. It also encompasses structures, people, policies, programs, campus resources, and practices that shape the way students experience success in community colleges. And here highlighted in red are the variables that we actually collect in the CCSM. And with that, I will transition to my colleague Luke Wood, who will present some salient insights and some important lessons and things that we've learned from the CCSM.
All right. Thank you. As Frank has already noted, we partnered with community colleges across the country to engage in institutional level needs assessment for male student populations. And what we're going to do today is really share some of those insights that we've gleaned from across the campuses. And the data that you're going to see are from a full sample of colleges that we've partnered with, which include 5,113 men from 27 community colleges in 7 states, including California, Arizona, Arkansas, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. Given the large number of information that we've collected today, we're just going to be able to really give you a snapshot of what we've seen. The last point I think would be important to make before kind of delving in here is to let you know that we collect a large number of categories: white students, Asian American, Southeast Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, Filipino, Black, Mexican, Mexican American descent, Hispanic, Latino, excluding Mexican, Mexican American descent, American Indian, Middle Eastern, multi-ethnic, and some others as well. So because we collect such a large amount of data from racial ethnic categories, we're only going to be able to focus on just a few of those today so that we can really hone in on success strategies and insights for men of color. And the first slide that we'd like to start out by showing you focuses on what we refer to as stressful life events. So in surveying men in our sample, we asked them to indicate the total number of stressful life events that they've experienced in the past 2 years. And we give them a number of different examples of what stressful life events could include, such as divorce, loss of a job, eviction, a relationship breakup, incarceration, a major change at work or illness in the family or death of a close family member. So a number of different options. And then what we do is we ask them to basically reflect upon the past 2 years and to indicate the total number of stressful life events that they've encountered. And we collect this information because we know that stressful life events tend to pull students away from college because then they become focused on factors that are more external to the institution and become less focused on their school. So in terms of those who experience what we call high numbers of stressful life events, which we categorize as 4 or above, we can see that more than 30% of Latino men in the sample experienced significant stressful life events. In addition, Southeast Asian men, including Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian men, represented the second highest group with at least 4 or more events at 23.6%. So what these data do is they help us to better understand that men of color are experiencing oftentimes some extreme challenges in their lives off campus that can have an effect on their ability to succeed in school. This next slide here just provides some more context to this conversation in that we're showing basically the primary educational goals of men in our sample. Now, we know that many students enter the community college with a myriad of goals. Some of them want to transfer or earn a certificate or an associate's degree, or some of them just want to update their job skills. So we collect this data from participants in 2 real key ways. One, we ask them, what is your primary educational goal, which is what you see on this slide. But we also ask them in a separate question to indicate some different goals that they have as well. But what we see here in terms of primary educational goal, that upwards of 45% of the respondents indicate that their goal is to transfer. And this is, I think, particularly in some ways disappointing given the data that Frank showed earlier, which showed that those who have that intent to transfer, only essentially 30% across the board for Black and Latino men are actually able to do so. And then again, the second most sought after goal in the sample you could see was earning an associate's degree. However, I think we also see some interesting patterns across the data. So for example, Asian American men, you can see here, have the lowest interest in comparison to the peers for earning an associate's degree, but slightly higher for earning a certificate, personal enjoyment, or updating their job skills. Black and Latino men, as you can see here also, are the most likely in the sample to indicate an interest in associate's degrees. And we also see some other nuances across groups. I think what these data help us to do is to understand that men of color enter the community college with different goals, and as a result, they also have different experiences that I think we need to be attuned to. And what this next slide does is help us get at some of those experiences that they're having in the community college. And what we're focused on here is what is referred to as validation. The research on community college students shows that validation is integral to student success. Validation, for those of you who may not be aware of this concept, refers to those key messages in communication that students receive from faculty and staff. Messages such as, you belong here, you can succeed, you have the ability to do the work. These messages are particularly important for men of color who oftentimes, based upon our work and that of others, we know they receive little validation in prior levels of schooling. So we know that this can have an effect on their perceptions of the usefulness of college. So this chart here depicts the total number of professors who regularly communicated to them that they can succeed. And when we look across the data, a number of students, roughly 30%, essentially across the sample, have never been communicated a message such as this from a faculty member. Clearly, we would like to see more men at the right-hand side of the slide with 5 or more experiences in receiving such messages. In this case, less than essentially 14% across the board received communications about their ability to succeed from faculty. Now, part of this could, of course, deal with the lack of ability for, given the total number of people that teachers, faculty have to teach, could deal with their inability to be able to reach out to every student. But we also know from our interviews and qualitative work with men of color that there's something else going on here as well. We know that men of color report to us that faculty members oftentimes use an approach me first or prove yourself first stance. For example, they tell us that faculty members are reluctant to interact with them unless they essentially show themselves approved first. So given the benefit of faculty validation for these students, we find these results to be somewhat disappointing. However, possibly even more concerning are the validation that they're receiving from staff members. As you can see here, roughly 50% of the sample, of men in the sample, did not receive validation from staff. This chart depicts students' responses to the total number of staff members on campus who regularly communicated to them that they belong at the institution. Given the high number of stressful life events experienced by these students, we would hope to see greater levels of validation to help counterbalance some of those effects. But beyond validation, there's other ways in which we can help to better understand the experiences that men of color face in community colleges. For example, we also can look at what's called campus racial gender climate. And we collect a number of different information regarding the campus racial gender climate. We look and ask students about the perceptions of whether faculty, staff, and students hold negative stereotypes about men from their racial ethnic group. Perceptions about the presence of stereotypes on campus we think are extremely important, as it helps to provide evidence of racial slights that are unknowingly and sometimes knowingly communicated to these men. In terms of men who had some degree of agreement that faculty members hold negative stereotypes about them, we see here that 23% of Southeast Asian men and 19% of black men in this sample indicated that they believed such stereotypes were evident from their faculty. I think this data is particularly important in light of some of the quotes presented earlier in this presentation by Frank. In addition, in our interviews with men of color, we've seen some similar evidence. For example, with black men, we've asked them to describe their actions in the classroom, and many of them report to us what we refer to as an apprehension to engage. Now, we distinguish between apprehension to engage and disengagement. This engagement suggests that the student doesn't want to be engaged, that there's nothing really there. But apprehension deals with a student who wants to engage, who has the desire to do so, but is reluctant to do so for some reason. And when we talk with men of color, they'll say that a faculty member will ask a question in the classroom, and they'll know the answer. Or a faculty member will ask, does anyone have any questions? And they have questions that they need answered, but they're afraid to do so, and they're fearful of doing so. And we say, well, why is that? And the words that they use really help to contextualize why that occurs. They tell us, well, they'll think that I'm dumb, I'm ignorant, I'm stupid, I'm unintelligent. And so what we believe this gets at is some of the campus racial gender climate that's being communicated to them about their place in the institution. We also collect data focused on care, perceptions of care, and we do this in a number of different areas. We look at students' perception of care with academic advisors, with career counseling, tutoring, computer labs, the library, and a number of other key areas. And we do so because we know that students' impressions of authentic care serve as a driver for their success. Here we see on this slide that 24% of Asian and 22% of Mexican American men disagreed to some level that staff members in academic advising cared about their success. We don't believe this is a small percentage, a fifth to a quarter of these students. Now, I think this data might be even more interesting in light of what we found in answering questions about service use. So in addition to asking about their care and perspectives of care in these areas, we also ask about their actual use of services in these areas as well. And here we see that upwards of 30% of all male students in this sample indicated they never went to academic advising. Here, 41% of Asian and 34% of Mexican American men, for example. And we did something interesting here. We looked at the information on the earlier slide from those who received perceptions of care and said that, you know what, I don't really feel like I'm being cared about. And we looked at the students who said that they never used academic advising in that term. And we saw a high degree of overlap in those students, in that those students who didn't use academic advising were in large part the same students who said that they did not perceive academic advisors as caring about them and their success. We believe that this speaks great volumes about the importance of illustrating authentic care for students. The next slide here focuses on students' perceptions of what we call service efficacy. Basically, whether they think the services on campus are useful for them in addressing the issues and challenges that they face. So here, students respond to the statement, campus services were critical to my success. And we see here a high percentage of men that felt that services were not critical. In fact, 25%, as you can see, of Southeast Asian men and 23% of Mexican American men reported this. Data like this in some ways make us wonder what messages students are receiving from staff, faculty, and fellow students that would make them respond in this manner. So, in fact, if you're on Twitter right now, we encourage you to provide any thoughts that you may have on this. Why do we see such a high degree of disagreement that services on campus are critical to their success? This next slide kind of circles back again to the comments that Frank had earlier about help seeking. Now, this is really the last bar chart we'll show, but we think this one is important because it really hones in on the role of masculinity and the effect of masculinity on student success. As Frank noted, we collect earlier, we collect masculinity information in 4 different areas. We look at men's perceptions of the role as breadwinners, their competitive ethos, their views of whether help seeking is okay to do as a man, and the perceptions of whether school is a domain that's equally suited for both men and for women. And these data here on this slide really, of course, focus on help seeking. Men in the sample were asked whether they were comfortable in seeking out help from others, such as faculty or staff. And as you can see here, 26% of Black and Latino men reported not being comfortable seeking out help. Again, 26% of Black and Latino men reported not being comfortable seeking out help. And in fact, one of the bars that kind of almost jumps off the page is the percentage of black men who disagreed with the statement at 17%, followed closely behind by Mexican-American men at 14%. In our work, and as you'll see on subsequent slides, we have found that health seeking is a core factor influencing outcomes for men of color. And we believe that this has really important implications for both academic and student affairs practice. So, of course, we collect a lot of information, right? But we also know that different variables have a different effect on success for different student populations. And so we think that that's important to recognize and help to contextualize for you. So what we've done here is we've looked at students' anticipated persistence, those students who indicated that they were planning to return and very confident that they would return that next semester in comparison to those who were planning to drop out, stop out, or were a little bit uncertain about whether they would return. And as you can see here, we've identified some key correlates, variables that are associated with their anticipated persistence. So for example, for black men, we see that service efficacy has a large positive effect on their success. So that means that those men who perceive campus services as being useful and helping them address their challenges, those students are more likely to indicate that they're going to persist. Those students who, as you can see, service access, believe that they have access to services on campus that help them to address their needs, also that has a strong positive effect on their success. Racial gender stereotypes has a negative effect, meaning that the more the presence of stereotypes that they're aware of the presence of stereotypes on their campus, the less likely they are to indicate that they will return. And faculty belonging is also a positive contributor. And we look at belonging in a different way than a lot of other groups do. We don't necessarily just ask the student, hey, do you feel like you belong on campus? We ask them to indicate whether they think that those people who they're interacting with, such as faculty, staff, students, whether they believe that they belong. So we ask students, for example, do you believe that faculty value interacting with you, value your presence in class, care about you, care about your success? And those, as we can see, when students say, yeah, they do, it does have a relationship with the persistence. As you can see in the bottom of the slide, we also focus on these non-cognitive variables, these intrapersonal factors that we know have an effect, and identity factors that we know have an effect on their success. So as you can see here, when men believe that school is a domain that's not only for women but equally suited for men as well, then they're better able to be successful in school. And we can provide some context to this on the next slide as to why that's important. Ethnic identity, having a positive ethnic identity, being able to seek out help, and viewing competition in a healthy manner, that if you're not able to be successful as other men, that it doesn't make you less of a man or a weaker man. But what we've also done for you is because we recognize that institutions don't have endless resources to be able to address problems facing men of color. On the right-hand side, you'll see the 3 strongest predictors in rank order. What these are the 3 most important factors that we have found that influence black male persistence in the community college. And as you can see, in rank order, they are service efficacy, whether they think those services are useful for them, whether they have healthy perceptions about seeking out help, and faculty validation, those key messages that you belong here, you can succeed, I believe in you. Those are integral. I spent a lot of time on that slide because you'll see a lot of overlap between the correlates for black male persistence and the correlates for Mexican-American male persistence. For example, we see here again, service efficacy, service access, the negative effect of racial gender stereotypes, the importance of belonging, the importance of healthy perceptions of school as a domain equally suited for men and women, of ethnic identity, of health seeking. So rather spend some time focusing on those items that were different for this population. And as you can see, one of them was staff care. Those men of Mexican-American descent who said that, you know what, staff members in academic advising and career counseling and tutoring services in the school library, they care about me. That is an important contributor to their success. to their persistence. Another thing you'll see down at the bottom here is breadwinner. Those men who have healthy perceptions about their role as a breadwinner, that it's not just for them, that that's not their sole responsibility, that have what we would call a healthy masculine perception of this. These men are more likely to be successful. But like, again, just as for black men, as we noted and just as we noted for black men, we also want to provide you with some key insights in terms of those most important predictors for Latino men. And as you can see here, help seeking was the most important factor that we found. Those men who have healthy perceptions that, you know, as a man, it's okay for me to seek out help, they were indicating higher levels of anticipated persistence. Those men who felt like they had access to campus services that they needed, they had higher anticipated levels of persistence. And lastly, those men who saw school as a domain that's equally suited for men and for women also were more likely to indicate an anticipated persistence. So I said that I'd address this more on the next slide. One of the things that's benefited at least me personally in really collaborating with Frank is that he's an expert in masculinity and the effect of identity on student success. And one of the things that I've learned through in partnering with him as in our work with the Minority Male Community College Collaborative is that throughout the early levels of education, men, young boys of color, are in classrooms where teachers that they are being taught by are primarily white and female. So as a result, these men are socialized in an environment where they see that the power structure of the classroom, the place in the classroom is meant for white women. Therefore, if they engage in school as a male, then they are acting like a wuss, a sissy, or somehow being less manly. And if they engage in a class as a student of color, then they are, in essence, it's in some ways acting white or negating their ethnic identity. And when we put together both of those concepts, and we see that men of color, in engaging in school, oftentimes feel in some ways that they're sacrificing their identity as both men and their identity as people of color. And so we think that that's important contextual insight. Another factor that we looked at was looking at what influences success for multi-ethnic men. We know that the population of multi-ethnic men is on the rise. And we also see some key factors that influence success for them. Service efficacy, whether they feel like those services are useful, whether they have access to services, whether they feel that staff members care about them. This one's unique. Whether they feel a connection to campus, to the students, to the faculty, to the staff, to the general campus community. On the bottom of this slide, we've also here highlighted some different non-cognitive variables that are important to consider for men of color, such as intrinsic interests, whether the students have an authentic interest in what the academic matters that they're engaged in, the course content that they're learning. Locus of control, which deals with their feelings of control and power over their academic future. Do they think that they have the ability to be successful? Do they think that they're in control of that? And degree utility, whether they perceive college as something that's a worthwhile endeavor for them in comparison to the myriad of other things that they can be doing. And on the right-hand side here, we've done the same thing. We've provided what are those three strongest predictors. And as you can see, service efficacy, whether they think that those services are useful for them, locus of control, whether they feel like they have control over their academic futures, and connectedness, whether they have a sense of connection to the campus. Lastly, in terms of slides dealing with this data that we've found through these partnerships, we'd like to focus on a predictor of success that's a little bit unique, and it's referred to as action control. Action control refers to students' directed attention towards academic matters, their focus or their effort. In fact, when we do qualitative research and interviews with men of color, and we ask them, what affects your success? One of the first things that they'll tell us is whether or not they're focused on school. We say, focus, what is that? Well, it's that action control, it's that directed attention that they place on academic matters. But we know that focus doesn't only come from within the student in terms of their interpersonal factors and their identity, but it also comes from the environments from which they're being educated in terms of the campus ethos and campus climate. And here we see some recurrent themes that predict students' focus or effort in academic matters. For example, for white and Asian men, we see that perceptions of school as a feminine domain is an important consideration. For white, Asian, and Mexican-American men, we see that having a sense of connectedness to the campus is important. For Asian, Southeast Asian, and Latino men, we see that having a positive perception of your own racial identity, what we refer to as ethnic affinity, is important. For Black and Mexican-American men, again, the recurrence of health seeking and the importance of health seeking on their success. For white, Southeast Asian men and multi-ethnic men, we see the importance of perceptions of belonging from faculty members, that they believe that faculty members care about them, value their opinion, want to interact with them. And another one here that we see for Black and Latino men are the importance of validating experiences from faculty, those messages that you belong here, you can succeed, I believe in you, you have the ability to do the work. Those we know are extremely important. So again, we present this data to help shape conversations on the importance of student focus in school, but to recognize that their focus in school is not only about what occurs within them, but also the environments that they're being educated in. And now I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Frank Harris.
Thank you all for staying with us. We know this is a lot of information coming relatively quickly. But we thought it was important that we conclude this webinar with some implications. So what does all this mean, and what do we as educators do with these insights and findings? And we'd like to start with an overarching principle that interventions that are targeted for men of color, they really need to account for the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. And oftentimes we see programs that are supposedly about men or men of color that do not address the issue of gender identity, masculinity, or some of the gender-related conflicts that we spoke about earlier. And then we also think there's some important implications for faculty development. So making sure that faculty are aware of racial ethnic stereotypes and microaggressions and have an understanding of what they are and how they might influence the experiences and engagement of men of color. We think that's important to do. And also talk about offer some ideas and strategies about culturally relevant instructional practices. Right now we're engaged in a study where we're reaching out to faculty at community colleges across the country and asking them, what are some strategies that you have found to be particularly effective for supporting men of color in your classes? What are the things that keep them engaged? What are the things that really seem to be facilitative of their success? And also being proactive and intrusive, particularly with the findings around apprehension to engage and some of the findings around faculty validation. We really hope faculty would be proactive in reaching out to men of color and understand that if they're not engaged or if they're not raising their hand to ask questions, it's not that they are not prepared, or it's not that they don't take the work seriously, but there may be some other underlying issues or concerns, and to be proactive in reaching out to them. And also doing it in a way that engenders validation and care for them. With respect to counseling and advising, we think advising and counseling is critically important for men of color in community colleges. We also think it has to be culturally relevant as well. And just like we're doing a study to look at what works in the classroom, we're also conducting a similar study to look at what are some effective counseling strategies for supporting and working with men of color as well. We also think advising needs to be intrusive, particularly academic advising. So the four-year model where we have advisors available and we expect students to find them and go to them doesn't seem to be the best strategy for this population. So finding ways to bring advising and make it accessible and available in spaces and times where we know men of color are going to be more likely to use them is important. We also believe every college, every community college should have an early alert system, not just for men of color, but probably for all of the students, to identify what are some of those early indicators that might suggest that a student is struggling or may be having trouble. And being proactive in providing resources, not at the end of the semester when grades have already posted, but as early in the semester as possible, so that there can be some opportunity for them to recover and perhaps get things back on track. Intake interviews, we think, are also an effective strategy for counselors. So we're designing some intake interview protocols now that kind of gives counselors and advisors some questions or some things they should ask in their early meetings with students, particularly men of color, to sort of get a sense of what some of their issues, concerns, assets, and challenges may be. With respect to institutes of research, we think going back to Estella Ben-Simon's concept of institutional accountability, we think the research practices that we employ should also happen through that same lens. So again, not focusing on students' deficits or what students are doing wrong, but really focusing on what can we as an institution do to make this place an affirming and welcoming place to support men of color in their work, to support men of color in their success. Disaggregating all institutional data by race, ethnicity, and gender, we think, is an important strategy. So we should never really look at data that aren't disaggregated in this way, because failure to do so can mask important inequities and outcome disparities. And also with respect to disaggregating data, really disaggregating the Asian and Latino population. There are many subgroups that are typically lumped within these categories, and those subgroups can have very different outcomes. So we think it's important that those populations are appropriately disaggregated as well. And also, our institutional assessment efforts have to go beyond engagement. We have to look at campus ethos. We have to look at masculinity and other factors that we know are unique to men of color, some that were highlighted throughout this webinar. Help seeking is another one. So those would be some important implications for institutional research. And then for institutional policy, we know that institutions tend to pay more attention to things that are measured. So having some measurable student success goals, or even perhaps having these goals embedded within the strategic plan for men of color or historically underserved students, could be an important implication for institutional policy. And we also, as we conclude and transition into the question and answer period, we would encourage you all to take a look at our website, particularly take a look at the Community College Survey, the Community College Student Success Inventory. If you're in your early efforts to develop an intervention or some sort of program for men of color, it's a great tool to get the conversation going. We've talked extensively about the CCSM as well, and we would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about it and perhaps partnering with us using the CCSM. We encourage you to be in touch with us as well. Lastly, we're going to plan to do many more webinars. This is the first one we've done, but we plan to do more throughout the year. The next one we've already have scheduled for July 1st, and there's a link on our website where you can go and get registered for that one, but that's going to focus on designing and implementing men of color or minority male initiatives that are often used as a strategy to impact student success of men of color. And then you see some of the other topics that we plan to touch upon as well. And lastly, we want to acknowledge our advisory board. These are mentors and colleagues who've really supported M2C3 from the very beginning and have advised us. And we think it's important to acknowledge them as well and for their contributions to the work that we're doing. And with that, we ended a few minutes early, and we'll transition and gladly take any questions that you may have. And I believe Andrea is going to open up the chat feature of the webinar so we can take some questions. And I should also note that we've been following and monitoring the Twitter feed throughout the webinar and have been responding to your questions that have been posted on Twitter. Those have been really good. And we have monitored the email account as well. Okay. So we have our first question. Any effort to secure males of college, I'm assuming that's males of color, on faculty at the colleges?
Well, we know that diversity among faculty is a very important facet. You know, men of color, is important for them to see men who look like them. And as you noted you know, as we presented some of the information on perceptions of school as a feminine domain, having representation among male faculty of color is important because it helps for them to see that, you know, school is not just a place for women alone, but a place that's equally suited for men and women. And we really believe that the institution sends and communicates messages about place, about belonging, about connectedness through not only their demographic composition, but also through the experiences that students have in their classroom. So we agree that it's a very important consideration. Another question we see here, are the survey tools in PDF and is it permissible to alter the tools? If you're interested in partnering with us, feel free and just reach out to us via email and we can answer any questions that you may have via that platform. We know that there are folks who might be interested in partnering with us for the survey, and we're more than willing to talk about that offline. And thank you to Ray Ostos from Maricopa Community College District for highlighting a presentation that we'll be doing there in Arizona on their Minority Male Initiative for their Faculty and Staff Dialogue Day. All right, what were some successful strategies used, successful strategies to get students to participate? I'm not sure whether you're referring to participating in the actual survey itself or to participate in class. We believe, I think that you're referring to participating in the classroom context. And we believe in what we refer to as institutional accountability. We believe that institutions themselves are responsible for fostering environments that support the success of men of color. And so we don't view it as a student deficit. We don't believe that men of color come into colleges necessarily with deficits. There are areas that they might need to grow, but all students need to grow in certain areas. But we believe the institutions are responsible for responding to them and meeting them where they're at and providing an environment of support, a campus climate, and resources that enable them to be successful. Learning communities, yes. We have found that learning communities is, in our research, not necessarily using this instrument, but learning communities in some of our other research, is one of the strongest predictors of success for black males, since that's what the question was about. But in particular, learning communities organized and focused around math, we believe is most important because math self-efficacy is also another important consideration, whether they feel like they're confident in math. So we believe that if you're designing learning communities, there's a number of different ways that they can be done, and there's a number of different models out there, but thinking about developing learning communities focused on some of those key subject areas that serve as barriers to their success.
We have another question. Did they ever conduct a campus climate survey? And we're interpreting that question as, have any of our partners, CCSM partners, conducted campus climate surveys? I'm not sure. I would imagine that some of them have. But we would also say that we get at some elements of campus climate for men of color in the CCSM. And particularly the campus ethos domain that we referred to earlier does get at some elements of campus climate and speaks to how men of color experience the climate. Another question. Oh, sorry, the chat is going by pretty quickly. Partnerships and collaboration with K-12 schools, particularly neighborhood, community, and theater high schools.
You know, one good example of collaborations and partnerships across level that's taking place is the Project Males and the University of Texas at Austin. There's a large state-level partnership that they have focused on men of color that links high schools, community colleges, and universities together to try to create a seamless pipeline. And if you can go to their website at Project Males to get more information on them, because they have some really good ideas in terms of how to create successful partnerships. And we know that partnerships are important in doing so. Okay, how do staff, faculty who interact with minority males daily and are committed to initiative get administration on board? This is actually one of the topics that's going to be discussed in the next webinar. We know that many minority male initiatives face challenges such as sustainability, scalability, resources to be able to continue the work that they're doing. So all of those kind of topics we're going to address in a whole separate seminar. But if you want to get something answered in between, then just feel free to shoot us an email and we can get some more information to you on that and some strategies that work. Have you looked at single-gender classes on college campuses? Yes. One of our partners in Maryland we participated with single-gender classrooms there, focusing on those factors that influence success of men of color. And one of the things that we found, again, there that we've also presented here is that having a perceptions of care from staff really was important to success for these men. So we've looked at both all kinds of different contexts with this. Okay, this message is from Kevin Christian from the American Association of Community Colleges. What key themes do you see emerging from the students that you interviewed? In addition, what things do you see coming from the respective campuses? Two-part question. All right. So in terms of the qualitative research that we've done, we've seen the importance of identity. Frank's work in looking at the importance of help-seeking, perceptions of breadwinning, school as a domain that's equally suited for men and women. And in my qualitative research has found, again, the importance of what we call action control, whether students feel that they are focused, whether students feel that they are cared about, are supported, are valued. We also know that there are factors such as their support from their friends who aren't on campus or family members who are on campus. It's also important to their success. The institution is responsible for providing a supportive environment for these students, but we also know that they're receiving messages off campus as well, which is why it's so important that students feel valued and respected and affirmed on the college campus. Can you please send out the slides? We're going to make the webinar available for those people who were registered for it. If you weren't registered for it, you can send us an email and we can add you to that distribution list to be able to receive it. So we're going to actually post it on our website, this webinar, hopefully sometime within the next couple days. I see your question, Archie. We will see what we can get over to you to help you with that question that you have. Studies examining Pacific Islander males. Okay, so for the research on men of color in the community college, the vast majority of that research focuses currently on black males and to a very, very much lesser degree on Latino males. And when I say lesser degree, I'm talking about maybe a handful of studies at most, namely from Victor Sines at the University of Texas at Austin and Marissa Vasquez-Urias, one of our doctoral alum from here at San Diego State University. Now, in terms of other populations such as Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, Native Americans, there's zero. And when I mean zero, when I say zero, there's literally zero peer-reviewed publications on these men in community colleges. That's why we believe that the work that we're doing is adding so much value to the campuses that we're partnering with, because we're providing information that's campus-specific that really gets at the nitty-gritty for each individual group. And as a result, we've been able to find some really interesting findings regarding, for example, Southeast Asian men, who their experiences and outcomes are on par with that of Black and Latino students.
Well, it looks like I think we've addressed all the questions so far in the chat. Derek Moore, thank you for the shout there as well. We look forward to having you on some of the upcoming webinars. Again, we'll make the recording of the webinar available as soon as possible. We'll make it available on our website, and we'll also email a link to those of you who are able to register for the webinar. We'll make sure you get an email with information about how to access it. And that's it. Happy rest of the day for everyone. Happy Good Friday. Thank you for joining us on Good Friday. And we look forward to getting in touch with you all in one way or another. Take care. Thank you.